Montana Territory, late autumn, 1881. The wind cut sharp through the cottonwoods, pulling gold leaves from their branches as Grace Bellamy staggered down the dirt road outside of Bridger's Pass, clutching her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her boots were falling apart. Her stomach was empty. Her fingers, raw from days walking and nights curled up under trees, trembled as she reached the edge of the ranch's yard. She had not eaten in 2 days. Her last coin had gone to buy a train ticket that never got her past Cheyenne. Now she was alone, cold and desperate. A tall man stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a dark cloth. He was all broad shoulders and quiet steps, a rifle slung across his back and a streak of dirt on his jaw. His eyes, under that wide-brimmed hat, narrowed when he saw her. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, voice low and rough like gravel. Grace tried to answer, but her knees buckled. She hit the dirt before she knew she was falling. When she woke, she was wrapped in a wool blanket by a warm hearth. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and stew. She sat up too fast and winced. "Easy," the man said from across the room. He was stirring something in a cast iron pot. "You fainted outside my barn. You got a name?" "Grace," she said, her voice hoarse. "Grace Bellamy." His mouth twitched, not unkindly. "I am Abram Keller." "You are safe here." She blinked at him, unsure if she believed that. But the warmth, the smell of cooked food, and the sight of a real bed made her eyes sting. He walked over with a tin plate and set it gently on her lap. A hunk of warm bread, a ladle of stew, a few slices of dried apple. "Eat," he said simply. Her hands trembled as she picked up the bread, biting into it like she had not tasted food in weeks. Tears slid down her cheeks silently, but she did not stop eating. Abram turned back to the stove, giving her space. When the plate was empty and her breathing steadied, Grace looked up at him. "Why are you helping me?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Because you looked like you had nowhere else to go." She lowered her eyes. "I don't." He sat across from her, arms resting on his knees. "Then you can have everything else too if you stay." She blinked at him, stunned. "The food, the roof, the warmth, this place. If you want it," he added, voice quieter now, "you can stay as long as you like." Grace held his gaze, trying to find the catch. She saw none. Just the quiet steadiness of a man who had meant every word. "I don't know what I could do to repay you." "You do not have to repay me, Grace, but this is a working ranch. If you stay, you help. That is all." She nodded slowly, something loosening in her chest. "I can wash, cook, mend." "I have worked before." Abram nodded once. "Then rest tonight. We will talk about work tomorrow." She looked down at the blanket wrapped around her, the empty plate in her lap. Her stomach full for the first time in days. The man across from her, quiet and sure, with no trace of pity in his tone. She had walked so far with nothing but fear and pain. And now, somehow, she had landed here. She fell asleep that night in Abram's spare bed, wrapped in warmth that was not just from the fire. The next morning, she rose early and found him already outside chopping wood. She tied back her hair and asked where the wash basin was. He showed her, silently, and she set to scrubbing dishes and sweeping the cabin. By mid-morning he came in and handed her a pair of boots. "They are too big," she said, surprised. "Better than falling apart," he answered, then returned to the barn. Days passed. Then a week. Grace cleaned the cabin, cooked what she could, mended his shirts. She never asked questions, and neither did he. But slowly, without meaning to, they began to talk. She learned he had run the ranch alone since his uncle died 5 years back. It was just Abram, a few horses, and a patch of land that stretched to the horizon. "Why stay out here all alone?" she asked one evening while slicing potatoes. "Because I like the quiet," he said. "And because I do not owe anything to anyone out here." She understood that. She told him little about her past, but enough. that she had worked as a maid in Kansas City, that her parents had died in a fire, that she had tried to make a life with a man who left her with nothing but a suitcase and a lie. "I walked from Cheyenne," she admitted one night, the words heavy. "I thought I could find work. But no one hires women who look like they have already lost everything." Abram had said nothing, just passed her a cup of coffee and sat beside her in silence. It was the kindest thing anyone had done in years. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry, she heard a cry behind the barn. She ran toward it and found Abram kneeling beside a small boy, no older than 6, with tangled hair and a scraped knee. "Name's Noah," the boy mumbled, eyes wide with fear. Grace dropped to her knees beside him, her heart twisting. "Where's your mama, Noah?" "She left me," he whispered. "Said she'd be back. That was yesterday." Abram's jaw tensed. He was hiding under the old wagon. Grace wrapped the boy in her arms. "You are safe now." They cleaned him up, fed him. He never asked to leave. He just started following Grace around like a shadow. "I do not think she is coming back," Abram said that night, watching the boy sleep. Grace nodded. "Then we will not let him go hungry again." Life settled into something steady. Noah slept in the cot beside Grace's bed. She taught him letters, helped him brush his hair. Abram built him a proper bed by hand. Grace watched him with the boy, the way he spoke softly, taught him how to feed the chickens, how to stack kindling. There was something in Abram's quiet patience that reached deep into her chest. One night, as they sat by the fire, Noah asleep between them, Abram looked at her for a long time. "You saved him," he said. Grace shook her head. "You took us both in." He reached for her hand. Calloused fingers brushed hers, rough and careful. She did not pull away. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "You can have everything else too, if you stay." She looked into his steady eyes, the warmth behind them, and felt something bloom inside her that she had not dared hope for. "I am not going anywhere," she whispered, and she meant it. The frost came in early that year, clinging to the edges of the windows by mid-October. Grace pulled an extra quilt over Noah's small frame before stepping out to the porch, where Abram leaned against the railing, watching the eastern sky lighten over the hills. He didn't speak at first. He just handed her a tin cup, steam curling from the rim. "It'll snow before November," he said finally. She nodded, fingers curling around the warmth. "I've never wintered this far north." "You'll need wool," he said, "and a coat that fits." Grace didn't answer. She stared out over the pasture, where 2 of Abram's horses stood still as stones, breath fogging the air. He turned slightly toward her. "You don't have to make do anymore, Grace." She looked down into her cup. "I don't know how not to." He didn't press her, just sipped his coffee and shifted his weight like he was settling into the silence. That afternoon, she found herself in the root cellar, taking inventory of what remained. She ran her hand over the burlap sacks, potatoes, dried beans, smoked pork. She counted the jars of apple preserves, the row of pickled beets. Enough, she thought, if they were careful. Later, as she was stitching a rip in one of Abram's shirts, Noah wandered in with a wooden box in his hands. He set it on the table and opened the lid. "Mr. Keller said I could use these." Inside, nestled in faded cloth, were a few worn readers, a slate, and some chalk. Grace touched the slate gently. "Where'd he find these?" "In the loft," Noah said. "He said his ma used to teach him letters, long time ago." Grace ran her thumb along the edge of the primer. "Then we'll use them right." From then on, mornings began with letters and numbers. Noah's brow furrowed in fierce concentration as he traced letters on the slate. When he stumbled, Grace guided his hand with her own. When he got it right, she let the corners of her mouth lift, just a little. One morning, as she was hanging a strip of tallow candles near the stove, Abram came in with a parcel wrapped in brown paper. He set it carefully on the table. "What's this?" she asked. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Went into town. Traded some pelts." She peeled back the paper slowly, a bolt of thick flannel in a deep blue and a pair of leather gloves small enough for her hands. "I figured you could sew something warm," he said. She touched the fabric, her throat tightening. "Thank you." He gave a short nod and reached for a chair, as though the air might hold too much between them if he stayed standing. "I saw a man in town," he said after a moment. "Said his sister's been running the post office since her husband passed. She's needing help come December." Grace folded the cloth in her lap. "You think I should go?" "I think you should choose," he said. "If you want something beyond this place, I'll see you there. But if this is what you want—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She looked out the window where Noah was helping stack firewood. His coat was too big, and he kept losing one of his mittens, but he didn't complain. "This is what I want," she said softly. Abram didn't speak, but he reached out and laid one hand over hers, warm and steady. That night, as the wind rose and the trees groaned under its weight, Grace lay awake listening to the sounds of the cabin. The soft creak of the roof, the rhythmic breathing of the child just a few feet away, the slow step of Abram's boots across the floorboards as he checked the fire. She turned toward the wall and shut her eyes, the weight in her chest no longer fear, but something else, something that steadied rather than sank. In the days that followed, they fell into a rhythm. Grace sewed a winter coat from the flannel, carefully lining it with scraps of wool. Abram repaired the chicken coop. Noah learned how to write his name without help. One evening, Abram took a small tin from the mantel and handed it to her wordlessly. Inside were a few coins, a button carved from bone, and a silver brooch shaped like a single leaf. "It was my mother's," he said. "She wore it every Sunday." Grace turned it over in her fingers. "I can't take this." He didn't reach for it. "I'm not asking you to, I'm offering." She studied his face, the quiet strength there, the way his eyes didn't waver. "I'll wear it," she said, "but only if you understand I'm not going anywhere." "I understand," he said. When she pinned it to her collar the next morning, Noah noticed first. He grinned and said it looked like something off a lady in a storybook. And Grace, for the first time in years, believed it might be true. As the first snow fell, soft as ash, Grace stood with Abram and Noah on the porch, wrapped in the coat she had made, watching the land change shape beneath the white. The wind was sharp, but she didn't feel cold. The snow deepened before the month turned. By the first Friday of November, the pasture was a white hush, broken only by the slow path Abram carved each morning with a shovel across the yard. Grace watched him from the window as she wrapped a strip of homespun around Noah's neck, tying it snug before sending him out to feed the hens. Inside, the cabin held close heat from the fire Abram banked each night. Grace had begun rising earlier than him, stirring coals to flame before the sun touched the sky. The quiet of those early hours settled something inside her that had once been always on edge. That morning, after Noah's boots had crunched off through the snow, Abram stepped inside, shaking frost from his hat. "Barn roof needs tending," he said, warming his hands near the stove. "Last storm tore loose a few shingles." Grace folded a quilt over the back of the rocker. "You'll need someone steady on the ladder. I can hold it for you." He caught her gaze. "You trust your footing on ice." "I worked a rooftop in Kansas City re-tarring a boarding house chimney." "It's not my first ladder." He nodded once and handed her a pair of woolen socks from the chest near the door. "Then bundle up." Outside, the wind had a bite, but the sun had come up clear. Abram set the ladder against the barn slope while Grace braced the base with her gloved hands. He climbed slow, carrying a hammer and a bundle of cedar shingles under one arm. She could hear the scrape and thud of his work overhead. "Where'd you learn to do repairs?" she asked, raising her voice just enough. He paused in his hammering. Uncle taught me, he said. When I was a boy, he said if I couldn't fix it, I didn't deserve to use it. Grace smiled to herself. Sounds like plain sense. He didn't answer, but the hammering resumed, steady as a heartbeat. When he was done, he climbed down slow, boots thudding on each rung. He stepped back, squinting up at his work. That should hold till spring. She looked up at the repaired edge. Looks solid. I'm glad you stayed, he said then, low enough she almost missed it. Grace's breath caught. She turned toward him. There's not a day I've regretted it. They stood there a moment longer, snow crunching beneath Noah's boots as he rounded the corner carrying a pail of feed too heavy for his arms. Grace reached for it, but Abram walked over first, taking it from the boy with one hand and ruffling his hair with the other. You're near strong enough, he told him. Give it another winter. Noah beamed, then trudged toward the coop, boots sinking deep. That evening, after supper, Abram unlatched a pine box from under the bed and brought it to the table. Inside were tools, chisels, a block plane, a thin saw with a worn wooden handle. I need your help, he said, setting the box down. Grace looked up from where she'd been darning one of Noah's stockings. With what? I want to build him a desk, Abram said. For his letters, the slates always sliding off the table. She set her needle aside. You want it done before Christmas, he nodded. If you measure and mark, I can cut and shape. Then we'll need boards that haven't warped. There's some in the shed, he said. Been curing since last spring. They worked by lamplight, side by side, Abram sanding the edges while Grace penciled lines across the plank tops. Her fingers smudged with graphite, his with sawdust. When their hands brushed, neither of them moved away. After they'd shaped the legs and fitted the drawer, Grace ran her hand along the grain. He's going to love this, she said. He'll think he's a schoolmaster. Abram smiled just slightly. That's the idea. Later, with the child asleep and the tools packed away, Grace stood by the fire, rubbing warmth back into her arms. Abram stepped behind her, close but not crowding. I'd like to ask you something, he said. She turned slowly, sensing the weight of his voice. Go on. I want you to have this place with me, not just live in it, share it. The land, the work, the boy, me. Her breath came shallow. The fire crackled low. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. I never thought I'd have something like this, she said. But I want it, all of it. I want you. He reached for her hand, held it between both of his. His skin was rough, but his grip was careful. We'll make it ours, he said. No one else's, just us. She nodded, eyes shining. Then let's begin. And together, they stood in the hush of winter, with the fire warming their backs and the road behind them sealed by snow. The desk was finished by the second week of December. Grace rubbed a beeswax cloth across its surface, while Noah circled it with reverence. Fingers trailing the clean edge of the drawer Abram had carved with a notch just right for a child's hand. That evening, with the sky paling into dusk, Abram hitched the wagon and brought Grace and Noah into town. Snow had packed the road hard, and the wheels creaked as they rolled past bare cottonwoods lining the trail. Grace wore the brooch on her collar, the pin fastened through the thick wool Abram had traded for weeks before. In town, lamplight flickered from the windows of the general store. A pine garland hung crooked across the porch rail, and a bell chimed as they stepped inside. The store smelled of kerosene, pine soap, and cured tobacco. Noah stood still beside the counter, eyes wide as he took in the wooden toys set on a shelf just above his reach. Abram gave no sign of noticing and asked for a bag of rye flour and a spool of black thread. Grace added a small tin of cloves to the counter. As the storekeeper wrapped the goods, Abram glanced down at Grace. You ever had a tree for Christmas? Grace shook her head. Not since I was a girl. We used to tie red string around the wood stove and pretend it was one. Noah tugged at her sleeve. Can we do that? We'll do better, Abram said, sliding a tin coin across the wood. We'll find a real tree. They left with parcels tied in brown paper, and Abram stopped the wagon near the edge of the woods on their way home. With Noah bundled in the back beneath a blanket, he handed Grace a hatchet. You pick it, he said. She walked a little ahead, crunching through snow until she spotted a fir no taller than her shoulder, its branches thick and even. She turned toward him, and he gave one quiet nod. They felled it together, Abram steadying the trunk while Grace struck the final cut. Back home, Noah helped carry in the tree, his mittens dusted in snow. They set it in a barrel weighted with stones, and Grace tied strips of calico into bows to hang from the branches. Noah added a pine cone he'd painted with ash and flour. That night, Abram boiled water with the cloves and set the kettle near the fire. The scent wrapped the room in warmth deeper than the heat itself. He poured 2 mugs and handed one to Grace, who curled her fingers around it and sat beside him on the floor, her skirt brushing his knee. A silence settled between them, not heavy but full. I never had much use for December, Abram said after a time. Too many shadows, too much quiet. Grace turned her head toward him. You ever spend one with someone else? Not since my uncle passed. She took a slow sip. Then this one'll be different. He looked at her then, not with surprise but with something steadier. It already is. The next morning she found a wrapped bundle on the table, tied with twine. She unwrapped it to find a length of green wool and a hand-stitched needle case made from one of Abram's old shirts. Noah beamed from the doorway. He did the stitches himself. She ran her thumb along the edge of the case, heart full. Later that day, Abram brought her to the pasture where a small lean-to had collapsed under snow. I'd like to build something better, he said. A shed for the tack, maybe a smokehouse beside it. Grace stepped beside him, hands in her coat pockets. We'll need to mark for drainage. And stone the foundation. He glanced down at her. You ever done that before? No, but I can learn. He smiled not wide but with his whole face and touched her shoulder with a lightness that lingered longer than it needed to. By week's end, the 3 of them had a routine that felt less like effort and more like rhythm. Noah read each morning at his desk, tracing syllables aloud. Grace worked at the sewing frame Abram had nailed to the wall, patching old linens into new quilts. Abram hauled hay, mended harnesses, and whistled softly sometimes when he thought no one was near enough to hear. One night, as they sat by the fire, Noah curled up on the bearskin rug. Grace turned toward Abram. I used to think peace was something you settled for. That it came when there was nothing left to fight. He shifted, watching the flames. And now I think it's something you build, one board at a time. He reached over, took her hand, and held it in both of his. Then let's keep building. She leaned against his shoulder, his warmth steady through the wool of his shirt. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet as breath. Inside, the fire burned low and every crackle sounded like promise. By late December, the creek behind the pasture had frozen solid in its slowest bends, thick enough for a child's boots. Grace stood at the bank one morning, watching Noah take cautious steps across the ice, arms stretched wide for balance. Abram stood at her side, a coil of rope looped over his shoulder just in case. He's steadier than he was, she said, glancing at the boy's determined little face. He's got your patience, Abram replied, and your jaw when he sets his mind to something. She looked up at him, caught off guard. You think so? He met her eyes, quiet certainty behind his. I know so. They stayed there a while, letting the cold creep into their boots, not minding. When Noah tired, they made their way back to the cabin, cheeks pink, arms full of kindling. Inside, Grace hung their coats near the stove and glanced at the wall where the calendar hung. The last page was nearly full. She'd written Noah's new words there each day, along with notes about the weather and how long the daylight had lasted. She'd never kept a calendar before, never seen much point. Now, she couldn't imagine not knowing what each day had held. Abram was mending a stirrup strap when she joined him at the table. He worked the awl through the leather with practiced ease. "Did your uncle teach you leatherwork too?" she asked. He nodded. "And my grandfather before him. Most of the men in my line made their living by their hands." She watched the way his fingers shaped the stitch. "You ever think of teaching Noah?" Abram looked over at the boy, who was kneeling by the hearth rearranging pine cones into the shape of a wagon. "If he wants it, I'll pass along everything I know. He already looks up to you." Abram's hand paused over the leather. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing right by him. He's not mine by blood." Grace reached across the table and laid her hand over his. "He doesn't need blood. He needs someone who stays." Abram turned his hand to hold hers, calluses rough against her palm. "Then I'll stay." "Long as you will." She didn't need to answer. He already knew. As the last days of the year crept by, they prepared for winter's deepest stretch. Abram brought in extra firewood, and Grace filled the root cellar shelves with loaves baked hard for keeping. Noah helped where he could, proud of every task they gave him. On the final day of the year, Abram hitched the wagon again, this time for a drive into the hills. He didn't say what for, only packed a parcel wrapped in muslin and asked Grace to come along. She brought a scarf to wrap her face and tucked a blanket around Noah before they set off. They stopped beneath a lone cottonwood that stood at the edge of a ridge, its branches bare against the sky. Abram climbed down and opened the parcel. Inside was a stone, smoothed and etched with careful lettering. "Will you help me set it?" he asked. Grace stepped down beside him, Noah climbing after her. He dug a shallow hole beneath the tree and placed the stone there. It read, "Elias Keller, 1827–1876. Honest hands, steady heart." "I carved it years back," Abram said quietly. "Never had a marker for him. He deserved one." Grace knelt beside the stone, brushing a bit of snow from the top. "He raised you, did his best with what he had. When I first came to him, I was angry, wouldn't speak for days. He taught me to work." That was his way of showing care. She looked up at him. "Sounds familiar." Abram's gaze met hers, something soft behind the steadiness. "I didn't know what a family was supposed to look like. Until now." Noah stood between them, his mittened hand slipping into Grace's. She closed her fingers around his and gave a small nod. They stayed until the wind picked up, then returned home in silence, the kind that felt full rather than empty. That evening, Grace lit a single beeswax candle and placed it on the windowsill. Abram joined her, his hand finding the small of her back. "I'd like to marry you," he said, "if you'll have me." She turned to him, her face lit gold by the flame. "There's no one else I'd ever want." He kissed her the first time he ever had, not rushed, not uncertain, just sure. They married in the spring, when the ground had softened and the creek ran again. The preacher came up from Bridger's Pass, and the three of them stood beneath the cottonwood where Abram had placed the stone. Grace wore a dress she'd sewn from pale muslin, and Noah held a bouquet of early wildflowers. Abram said his vows slowly, his voice steady. Grace's hand never left his. After they returned to the cabin, where the breeze carried the scent of thawed earth and sap. Grace brewed coffee, and Abram carved a new name into the beam above the hearth, Grace Keller, etched beside his own. The seasons turned. The garden grew. Noah's desk filled with drawings and letters, and his boots outgrew the ones Grace had patched 3 times over. One warm evening the following summer, Abram came in from the barn and found Grace sitting on the porch, sewing a small shirt from a bolt of soft cotton. He leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. "You planning ahead?" She looked up, smile slow and full. "We'll need more than one pair of hands soon." He crossed the yard to her and knelt, pressing his forehead to hers. "Then we'll build room." They sat there until the stars came out, the three of them and one more on the way. The winters still came hard. The work never slowed. But they had built something that held fast, wood warmed by fire, hands joined by choice, and a life stitched from the quiet, enduring kind of love that never needed to be spoken to be known.